Little girl selling her mother's ring for food. Rich cowboy gives them a cabin instead. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the dusty plains of Ixan. 7. The small colony, a mix of human settlers and alien traders, struggled to survive on the harsh, unforgiving planet. The dust settled on every surface, the wind carrying it in every direction. The locals had learned to live with it, but newcomers like Jace Holloway still found it hard to get used to. Jace had heard whispers about this place for years, tales of its wild frontier and the strange customs of its people. He had come to escape the past, to put behind him a life filled with disappointments. But what he hadn't expected was to find himself standing in the middle of a dusty auction house, about to make a decision that would change his life forever. Jace had always prided himself on being a man of few words, but this situation left him with a strange feeling in his gut. He had heard about the marriage trade, a custom of buying brides as a way to secure alliances and strengthen families. It wasn't something that sat right with him, but when the auctioneer had mentioned the price, just $3, he couldn't help but be curious. The young woman on display was a vision. She stood silently on the stage, her head bowed, her long brown hair falling over her shoulders. She was beautiful, with delicate features and an air of sadness that seemed to surround her. Jace couldn't take his eyes off her. He wasn't sure what drew him in, the beauty in her eyes or the deep, quiet pain that seemed to echo in her every movement. Ellie had known this day would come. She had heard the whispers, felt the cold eyes of her family as they made the decision to trade her away. She had been raised in a world where women were bartered like cattle, their worth determined by their family's standing. At 19, she had never been given a choice in her own future. The auctioneer's voice rang out, pulling her from her thoughts. For the price of just 3 credits, we have the finest daughter of the Solari family. A virgin bride, untouched and pure. Who will take her? The crowd murmured, some nodding, some shaking their heads in disapproval. But Ellie had no illusions. She was nothing more than a transaction to them. Jace had no intentions of taking the bride. He was here on business, looking for work to survive, nothing more. But when the auctioneer's eyes landed on him, something inside Jace stirred. His instincts told him to turn away, to walk out and leave this behind. But instead, he found himself standing, his hand rising to signal his bid. 3 credits, Jace called out, his voice firm and steady. A moment of silence passed, followed by a murmur of surprise. The crowd had been expecting more, but Jace's bid was all that mattered. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with approval. Sold. To the man in the back, for 3 credits. The auctioneer's voice rang out, and Jace felt the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. Ellie's heart raced in her chest. She had been sold just like that. 3 credits, hardly enough to buy a meal, let alone a life. She had no say in the matter, no control over her fate. She lifted her eyes to meet Jace's gaze, and for the briefest of moments she saw something in his eyes. A flicker of pity, perhaps, but it was quickly gone, replaced by a cool indifference. Jace stepped forward, and Ellie instinctively took a step back. She didn't want this, she didn't want him. But what choice did she have? Without a word, Jace extended his hand to her. Ellie hesitated, then took it reluctantly. As he led her out of the auction house, the eyes of the crowd followed them. Some sympathetic, some judgmental. Ellie could feel their gaze on her, a silent reminder of her worth, or lack thereof. The journey to Jace's homestead was silent. Ellie had no idea what to say. She had never been in a situation like this before, never imagined that her life would lead to such an empty fate. Jace, on the other hand, seemed content to let the silence linger. He wasn't an emotional man, not like the stories she had heard about romantic heroes. He didn't speak to her, didn't try to console her. He simply drove the speeder, eyes fixed on the horizon. When they reached the homestead, a small cabin on the edge of the colony, Jace didn't ask for any thanks, nor did he offer any. He simply opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Ellie stood at the threshold, unsure of what to do. This was her new life, she realized, a life with a man she barely knew, in a world that had sold her for a handful of credits. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the small, utilitarian cabin. It was clean but sparse, with only the barest of furnishings. The walls were bare, the air thick with the scent of dust and old wood. Jace had made no effort to make it welcoming. It was clear to Ellie that this wasn't a home, at least not in the way she had imagined. "Make yourself at home," Jace said, his voice flat as he moved toward the small kitchen area. He didn't look back to see if she had followed. Ellie stood in the middle of the room, trying to make sense of the strange turn her life had taken. How had she ended up here, with this man, in this place? Was this really her future? She looked at Jace, who was now rummaging through the kitchen, and then she looked down at her hands. She wanted to scream, to break free from this nightmare, But the reality was clear. She had no choice. In that moment, Ellie realized that she was a prisoner, not just of her family, but of this unforgiving world. And for the first time, she wondered if she would ever truly escape. Jace Holloway sat in the small, dimly lit auction house, his boots scraping the dusty floor as he shifted uncomfortably. Outside, the twin sons of Yixan. 7 beat down relentlessly on the barren land, casting long shadows on the scattered colony that had settled here. A few crumbled buildings and worn-out transport ships were all that remained of the once promising settlement. Life on this harsh, desolate planet was hard, and even harder for newcomers like Jace. The cowboy had arrived on Yuzan, 7 seeking work, running from a past he preferred to forget. He didn't expect much more than a job to get by, but he certainly hadn't expected to find himself in this position. Yet here he was, surrounded by a crowd of rough locals and traders, all seated on wooden benches as a strange kind of auction took place before him. 3 credits, the auctioneer's voice rang out, drawing his attention back to the stage. Jace glanced up. A young woman stood there, her head bowed, hands clasped in front of her. She was dressed simply, the loose-fitting garment emphasizing her youth and slender frame. She was beautiful, with long brown hair that cascaded over her shoulders and skin as pale as the moonlit sands outside. Her eyes, though, were a story of their own, eyes that seemed tired, distant, and full of a sadness Jace could feel from where he sat. The auctioneer's voice echoed again, and Jace was momentarily lost in thought. "A virgin bride, untouched, pure," the man boomed, his voice thick with pride. "The finest daughter of the Solari family, a woman worthy of a great life, now available for purchase. Who will start the bidding?" Jace shifted in his seat, not entirely sure of what he had just heard. This was not what he expected when he signed up for a life on the frontier. The auctioneer's words hung in the air as Jace tried to make sense of the situation. A bride? Bought? For just a few credits? The thought gnawed at him. He wasn't a man who believed in bartering human lives like cattle. But there was something about this particular auction that didn't sit right with him. He couldn't just sit there and let this happen, could he? 3 credits, the auctioneer called again, turning to the crowd, waiting for anyone to raise the bid. The room was tense with anticipation. Jace's heart raced, but he wasn't sure why. Was he really going to do this? His hand moved almost without thinking, lifting into the air. 3 credits, he called, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. The auctioneer turned, eyes glinting with surprise. 3 credits, is it? He asked, raising an eyebrow. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jace barely noticed the whispers or the curious glances sent his way. All he could focus on was the woman standing there, still silent, still distant. The moment stretched on like an eternity before the auctioneer finally gave a nod of approval. "Sold," he said. "To the man in the back for 3 credits." Jace stood, his legs stiff as he walked toward the stage. He couldn't believe what he had just done, but it was too late to turn back now. The young woman didn't look at him as he approached. She kept her eyes down, her shoulders hunched in quiet resignation. Her life had been traded just like that. She had no say in the matter, no power to change her fate. Jace could see it in the way she moved, the way she stood so still, as though bracing for something worse to come. When he reached her, Jace hesitated. He wasn't sure what to do next. He had paid for her. What did that even mean? She wasn't just some object he could claim. No, this wasn't right. And yet, the reality of the situation was undeniable. "Come on," Jace said, his voice rough. He reached out, offering his hand to her, but she didn't look up. She didn't move. A small voice inside him urged him to walk away, to leave the situation behind and never return. But something else, a stronger impulse perhaps, pushed him forward. He had to help her, didn't he? "Please," he said softly, his voice quieter now. "We're leaving." She looked up at him then, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, Jace could see the fear, the pain, the confusion. And something else, something unexpected. She wasn't angry, though she had every right to be. No, she was simply lost. Ellie, as the auctioneer had called her, didn't take his hand immediately. She stood frozen, as if the idea of being taken away by this stranger, this cowboy, was something she couldn't quite comprehend. She had been sold to him, but the reality of it hadn't sunk in. "I'm Ellie," she whispered, barely audible. "But you don't have to take me. I'm not your property." Jace felt a pang of guilt strike him, but he quickly masked it. "I don't want to own you," he said, his words measured. "I'm just trying to get by like everyone else here." "You've been forced into this, just like me." Ellie shook her head slightly as though she didn't believe him. But she didn't pull away either. She was silent as Jace led her out of the auction house, her feet dragging behind him. The moment they stepped outside, the sun hit them hard. It was almost as if the light here was different, stronger, more unforgiving. The colony stretched out before them, its dusty streets lined with small homes, shacks, and shops. The air tasted dry, heavy with dust and the scent of metal. Jace gestured to his transport vehicle, an old, weathered speeder. "Get in," he said, and after a long pause, Ellie did. She slid in beside him, her hands clasped tightly on her lap, her gaze out the window. The ride was silent, the engine humming as the speeder rolled over the uneven terrain. Jace tried to think of something to say, but words didn't come easily. Ellie didn't seem to want to talk anyway. When they finally arrived at his homestead, Jace parked the speeder and turned to Ellie. "This is it. Not much, but it's home." Ellie glanced around at the small, modest cabin, her expression unreadable. It was nothing like what she had been promised, nothing like the life she had imagined, but it was hers now, whether she wanted it or not. "Make yourself at home," Jace said, but Ellie didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the ground. Jace stepped inside, leaving her alone for a moment. He wasn't sure what he expected her to do, cry, scream, beg to be freed, but nothing happened. There was only silence. Ellie finally walked in, her eyes scanning the simple room. The homestead was small, just a one-room cabin with a simple bed, a table, and a few basic furnishings. It wasn't much, but it was all Jace had. He sat down at the table, running a hand through his hair. He had done something he never thought he would do. He had bought a bride, but this wasn't how it was supposed to be. She wasn't just a prize. She was a person, with her own fears, her own desires. Jace stood up, walking over to Ellie. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice softer now. "I'm not here to hurt you. I don't want to control you. You're free to leave whenever you want, but if you need help, I'll be here." For the first time, Ellie looked at him directly. Her eyes softened, though the sadness remained. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. The days passed quietly at Jace's homestead. The harsh winds of Yexan. Seven continued to howl outside, but inside there was only the steady rhythm of silence between Jace and Ellie. It wasn't comfortable silence, but it was the kind of silence that filled the space between strangers, a gap that neither seemed able to bridge. Jace worked on the farm during the day, fixing up the cabin and repairing the old machinery he had inherited. Ellie spent her time indoors, staring out the window or reading old books she found in the corner of the small cabin. She had never been one to speak much, but now, in this strange place, words were even harder to find. She hadn't spoken to Jace much since their arrival, and she wasn't sure what she was supposed to say. Her life had been turned upside down in the blink of an eye. Everything she had known was now gone, replaced by a new world that seemed foreign and terrifying. But there was one thing she had realized. She wasn't just a bride. She was a pawn in a much bigger game. She had been sold for more than just her dowry. Her family, those she had once trusted, had made a deal that would change everything. It happened one evening when Jace had gone out to the local market to trade some supplies. Ellie had stayed behind, sorting through the things left in the cabin. She came across an old leather-bound journal hidden in the bottom drawer of the table. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was familiar. It was her father's. With trembling hands, Ellie opened the journal, scanning the words. At first the entry seemed like any other, a record of her father's day-to-day dealings with the local traders, the usual back and forth of running a farm in a harsh environment. But as she flipped further into the pages, the tone changed. There were notes about debts, massive amounts of money owed to off-world traders. There were mentions of alien treaties, deals with people who held power beyond the stars, and there, in bold, underlined letters, was her name, Ellie Solari, final bargaining chip. Her heart stopped. She couldn't believe what she was reading. Her life, her future, her very existence had all been part of some grand scheme. Her family's wealth, their power, it had all been built on the backs of deals just like this one. She wasn't just a pawn in a marriage arrangement. She was the key to her family's survival. The journal detailed the arrangements her father had made to secure her marriage to Jace. He had been paid in credits, but more importantly, Ellie's union was a means to an end. The Solari family was in financial ruin, and they had been forced to sell their daughter to someone who could protect them. Ellie slammed the journal shut, her hand shaking. She wanted to throw it across the room, but instead she held it tightly to her chest. Everything she had known about her family, her place in the world, had been shattered. She wasn't just being sold for a few credits. She was a means to an end in a game much larger than herself. When Jace returned that evening, he could see the change in her. Ellie was quieter than usual, her eyes distant as she stared out the window, lost in thought. She didn't greet him when he entered. "Ellie?" Jace's voice was soft, but there was concern in it. He had noticed the tension between them over the past few days. They hadn't really spoken since the auction, and it was starting to bother him. He had never expected things to be easy, but this silence, it was unsettling. Ellie didn't respond right away. Her thoughts were too loud. The weight of the journal's revelation still heavy in her mind. She had never been so alone. Finally she spoke. "I'm not just a bride, Jace." Jace's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Ellie turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I was sold, not just to you, but to this whole system. I'm part of some deal that my family made to save themselves." Jace didn't speak for a moment, trying to understand what she meant. He could see the pain in her eyes. "Ellie, I didn't know. I didn't ask for this. I'm not your family. I didn't come here to buy you like some object." Ellie's voice broke. "You didn't come here to buy me, but that's what happened. I'm not some prize to be traded. I'm a person, Jace, and now I don't even know who I am anymore." Jace took a step forward, his face softening. He hadn't known the full story. He hadn't known about the debts, the deals, the desperation that had led her family to sell her. His heart ached for her, but he didn't know how to fix what was broken. "Ellie, He stopped himself. What could he say? What could he do?
He had tried to be kind, to give her space, but it wasn't enough.
It would never be enough to erase the pain of what had happened to her. "I know this isn't what you wanted," Jace said finally, his voice low. "I never wanted this for you. But I'm not your enemy, Ellie. I may not be able to fix what's happened, but I can protect you. I can give you a life away from all of this." Ellie shook her head. "You can't protect me from my family's mistakes. You can't protect me from the way the world works. All I am now is a pawn in their game." Her voice trembled as she spoke the words she had never said out loud. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what to do." Jay stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. He wanted to help her, to tell her that things would get better, but the truth was, he didn't know if they would. He only knew one thing for certain. Ellie deserved more than this. "I'll help you," Jace said, his voice firm. "I don't care about the debts or the deals. I care about you. If you want to leave, if you want to fight back against your family, I'll stand by you." Ellie's eyes searched his face, looking for the truth in his words. She didn't trust easily. Not anymore. But in that moment, she saw something in Jace. Something genuine. Maybe he wasn't just a stranger she had been sold to. Maybe he was something more. "I'll think about it," Ellie whispered, her voice still filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. The days following their conversation were different. Jace and Ellie no longer tiptoed around each other in silence. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a mutual respect that had slowly formed as they shared their stories. The weight of Ellie's past still hung heavy in the air, but now it was something they both faced together. Ellie spent more time outside walking the dusty land around Jace's homestead. She had always been a quiet observer of life, but now she was trying to find her own voice, her own strength. Every morning, she watched the sun rise over the barren horizon, her thoughts swirling with possibilities. She had been sold, but that didn't mean she had to stay sold. She could fight back, couldn't she? One afternoon, after a long day of working in the fields, Jace sat on the porch wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked over at Ellie, who was sitting on the edge of the porch, staring out at the horizon. "I can't keep living like this," Ellie said quietly, her voice steady but filled with determination. "I don't want to be a pawn in my family's game anymore. I want to take control of my own life." Jace glanced at her, his heart swelling with pride. "You don't have to do this alone, Ellie. If you want to fight back, I'm with you. I don't care what it takes." Ellie turned to him, her eyes fierce. "Then let's do it. Let's take down my family. Let's stop them from using me as a bargaining chip." Jace stood up, his expression serious. "You've got a lot of fight in you, but I'm not going to lie, it won't be easy. Your family has power. They've got connections with people who don't care about right or wrong. But if you're ready, I'll stand by you every step of the way." Ellie nodded, her jaw set with resolve. "I'm ready. I'm not going to let them control me anymore. I want my life back." That night, as the stars lit up the sky above them, Jace and Ellie made their plans. They knew they had to be careful. The Solari family was wealthy, influential, and connected to off-world traders and powerful alien factions. Ellie's father had built his empire on deals just like the one that had led to her being sold. It wasn't going to be easy to undo the mess he had created. But Ellie wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't the scared, helpless girl who had been handed over for a few credits. She was a woman who had learned the truth about her worth, and she was ready to fight for it. The next morning, Jace and Ellie set off together, heading toward the central hub of the colony. There was a small office there where legal matters were handled, and they knew they needed to get the proper documents to make sure Ellie was free. It was a long shot, but it was their best chance. The air was thick with dust as they arrived at the office. Jace walked in first, his boots clicking sharply on the floor. The clerk behind the counter looked up, a bored expression on his face. He barely acknowledged Jace as he walked up to the counter. "I need to speak to someone about changing a legal contract," Jace said, his tone calm but firm. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Changing a contract? What kind of contract?" Jace glanced over his shoulder at Ellie, who was standing quietly behind him. "It's a marriage contract," he said. "We need to make it null and void." The clerk blinked, looking at Ellie. He saw the calm determination in her eyes, and something in him seemed to shift. He stood up slowly. "Follow me," he said, his voice much softer than before. They followed him down a narrow hallway to a back office. The clerk shut the door behind them and sat down at a desk, pulling out a stack of papers. He didn't speak right away, and the tension in the room grew thick. Ellie's heart raced as she waited, unsure of what to expect. Finally, the clerk looked up. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said quietly. "What you're asking is risky. The Solari family isn't just powerful here. They've got connections with people who control more than just this planet." But he hesitated, glancing at Ellie's face again. "But I've seen what they've done. I've seen what they do to people like you. And I'm not going to stand by and watch them continue to use you like this." Ellie's eyes widened. "You'll help us?" The clerk nodded. "I'll help, but you need to be ready. Once this goes through, there's no turning back. The Solari family will come after you. You'll have enemies everywhere. Are you ready for that?" Ellie didn't hesitate. "I've been living in fear my whole life. I'm ready to take my life back." Jace placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady and reassuring. "We're ready." The clerk nodded and began typing quickly on the keyboard. "I'll make the necessary changes to the records. It won't be official until I submit it to the council, but I can make sure they can't track you anymore. You'll be free." After what felt like an eternity, the clerk looked up. "It's done. You're free." Ellie's heart raced. The weight of her past seemed to lift, just a little. She was no longer a part of the Solari family's business. She was free to choose her own path. Jace smiled at her, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "You did it. You're free." Ellie looked at him, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "We did it." As they walked out of the office together, Ellie's eyes were clear for the first time in years. The world ahead of her was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. There was no going back now. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Ellie felt hope stir inside her. Jace looked at her, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "Whatever happens next, I've got your back." "You're not alone anymore." Ellie nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "And for the first time, I feel like I can face whatever comes." As they left the office and stepped into the dusty streets of the colony, the sun setting behind them, Ellie realized something important. She had been sold, but she was no longer a commodity. She was a person, with a future, with choices. And that, she knew, was the most powerful thing she could ever have.